You blow out 30 candles. Somewhere, someone hands you a card that jokes about getting old. For most of human history, 30 wasn't the beginning of anything. It was, according to the most quoted statistic in pop science, close to the end. Here's the number you've probably heard. Average life expectancy in the Stone Age was around 30 years. It gets repeated in documentaries, textbooks, and 1,000 internet lists. It is also, in the way most people understand it, almost completely misleading. This is the detail that gets me every time. That number is real, but it is measuring something very different from what you think it's measuring. The idea has old roots. In 1651, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes described life without civilization as nasty, brutish, and short. He wasn't citing archaeological data. He was making a political argument about why people needed strong governments. But his phrase outlived its original argument and got quietly bolted onto every popular retelling of prehistory since. Somewhere along the way, a philosophical guess turned into a statistic, and the statistic turned into a fact everyone just knows. Except the fact isn't quite what it seems. Let's start with where the number actually comes from. Paleodemographers, researchers who reconstruct population patterns from skeletal remains found in ancient cemeteries, estimate the age of death for every skeleton they can analyze, usually by looking at tooth wear, bone density, and the fusion of skull sutures. Then they average all of those ages together. If you do that for most ancient populations, you land somewhere in the 20s or 30s. That part isn't a lie. It's an honest average. And averages, especially in demography, hide almost everything interesting about a population. Here's why. Infant and child mortality in the ancient world was staggering. And it's the real driver behind that low number. Anthropologist Nancy Howell spent years living with and studying the Jew, Hoanzi, a foraging people of the Kalahari in southern Africa, through the 1960s and 70s. It's worth being clear here. The Jew, Hoanzi, are a contemporary people living modern lives, not a frozen window into the Stone Age. Howell studied them because their subsistence lifestyle offers a useful comparison for certain conditions our ancestors faced, not because they represent unchanged cavemen. Her demographic data, drawn from real births and deaths, she recorded herself rather than skeletons, showed that close to half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Disease, infection, difficult births, accidents. It was brutal, and by all evidence, it was common across many ancient and traditional populations, not just this one. Now do the math. If half a population dies at age 2, and the other half lives to 60, 70, or 80, the average age of death at the population level still comes out low, somewhere around 30. But almost nobody in that population actually died at 30. Very few people cluster around that number at all. Do you see the trick the average is playing? It's the same trick as saying a room with 1 billionaire and 9 unemployed people has an average income of $1 million. Technically true, practically useless. This is where a landmark study changes the whole picture. In 2007, anthropologists Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan published a cross-cultural review in the journal Population and Development Review, pulling together mortality data from dozens of hunter-gatherer and forager populations around the world, including the Hadza of Tanzania, the Aceh of Paraguay, and the Jew Hoanzi. Their finding was striking. Once you survived childhood, once you made it past roughly age 15, your most likely age of death, what statisticians call the modal adult lifespan, clustered between 68 and 78 years old, across nearly every population they examined. Not 30, not 40, 68 to 78. That's strikingly close to modern life expectancy in wealthy countries today, minus modern medicine's ability to catch cancer early or manage chronic heart disease. A separate long-term study of the Aceh people of Paraguay, conducted by anthropologists Kim Hill and Ana Magdalena Hurtado starting in the 1980s, found a similar pattern. Adults who survived their first 15 years had a real chance of reaching their 60s and beyond, even while overall childhood mortality remained brutally high by modern standards. 2 different continents, 2 unrelated populations, and the same underlying shape kept showing up. A population weighed down by early death, sitting on top of adults who, once past the danger zone, Aged the way humans have apparently been built to age for a very long time. So which number is the real one? Honestly, they're both real, and that's the uncomfortable part. Average life expectancy at birth really was low, dragged down hard by child mortality. And adult life expectancy, if you made it through the dangerous early years, really was close to what a lot of grandparents experience right now. Two true numbers, telling almost opposite stories, and pop culture only ever repeats one of them. There's fossil evidence for this too, and it comes from an unlikely place. Teeth. In 2004, paleoanthropologists Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee examined dental wear patterns across hundreds of fossil hominin remains to estimate age at death, comparing older human ancestor populations, Neanderthals, and early modern humans across Europe and Africa. Their study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found something researchers hadn't expected. Starting around the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 30,000 years ago, the ratio of older adults to younger adults jumped sharply. In some samples, more than fourfold. Grandparents, in other words, started showing up in the fossil record in much greater numbers. Kaspari and Lee argued this wasn't because people suddenly stopped dying young in infancy. It's because more people were surviving long enough to become old, and that shift may have reshaped human society, culture, and even how knowledge got passed down between generations. Neanderthals present a more contested case, and it's worth being honest about the disagreement rather than smoothing it over. Paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkaus, studying Neanderthal skeletal remains, documented mortality patterns that skewed younger than those later modern human populations, along with a striking number of healed injuries suggesting a physically punishing way of life. Researchers are still split on exactly why fewer Neanderthals reached old age. It may have been higher injury rates from close-range hunting, smaller social networks with less support for the frail, or simply the harsher climates many Neanderthal populations faced. The evidence points somewhere, but it doesn't point in just one direction. And any documentary that tells you it has a clean, settled answer is skipping the actual debate. Why would longer adult lifespans matter so much for our species specifically? This is where a different piece of research comes in. The grandmother hypothesis, developed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, based on her fieldwork with the Hadza. Hawkes noticed that Hadza grandmothers, women well past their own reproductive years, spent enormous amounts of time gathering food, specifically tubers that are hard to dig and process, and feeding it to their grandchildren. That labor freed up mothers to have more children sooner because someone else was helping keep the older kids fed and alive. Hawkes proposed that this is part of why humans evolved unusually long post-reproductive lifespans in the first place, compared to most other primates. Grandmothers weren't leftover biology after menopause. They may have been a survival technology baked into the shape of human life history. It also helps to understand why child mortality clustered so heavily around certain ages, instead of being spread evenly across childhood. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe, who conducted extensive fieldwork with the Hadza over more than 2 decades, documented that the most dangerous window for a child wasn't infancy itself, but the period right around weaning, when a toddler stopped relying on breast milk and started eating the same foods and drinking the same water as everyone else. That transition exposed children to gut infections and parasites their bodies hadn't built up defenses against yet. Once a child made it a few years past weaning, their odds improved substantially and kept improving with every year survived. The danger wasn't a flat, constant threat hanging over the first 18 years of life. It was concentrated, brutal, and then, for those who got through it, it largely lifted. Let's picture what this actually looked like day to day, because the archaeology and the ethnographic comparisons together let us reconstruct it fairly concretely. A campsite, a fire, several generations sitting around it, not 2, but 3. A woman in her 60s, her joints aching from decades of walking and kneeling, is still working, still teaching a 9-year-old how to test a root for ripeness before it's dug from the ground. Nearby, a mother nurses an infant while an older child runs small errands between the fire and the tree line. An older man repairs a tool, showing a boy how the stone flakes should be struck. This wasn't a lucky scene reserved for the fortunate few. Once you strip out the children who never made it past their 5th birthday, This was closer to the ordinary shape of daily life than the everyone dies at 30 version most people carry around in their heads. None of this erases how hard the early years genuinely were, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Researchers are still split on exactly which threats mattered most in which environments. The risks in the Kalahari weren't identical to the risks in Ice Age Europe or the tropical forests of Paraguay. Childbirth carried real danger for both mother and infant, without the interventions available today. Infection from something as small as a cut could turn fatal without antibiotics. Predators, seasonal starvation, and, in some periods and places, violence between groups all took a measurable toll that shows up clearly in skeletal remains, including healed fractures and, less often, injuries that clearly weren't survived. This period of life was genuinely dangerous, and it's worth resisting the urge to romanticize it just to correct one myth with another. But here's the twist that the died at 30 version completely erases. Getting old wasn't rare for ancient humans who made it through childhood. Staying alive long enough to get old was the hard part, and once someone cleared that bar, a long life was well within ordinary reach for tens of thousands of years, long before anyone in the family line had ever seen a hospital, a vaccine, or a bag of antibiotics. There's a modern mirror here, and it's not the one you'd expect. We still misread averages exactly this way, constantly. A city's average commute time hides the people stuck in traffic for 2 hours, and the people who walk to work in 10 minutes. A company's average salary can look healthy on a recruiting page, while most employees earn far less than a handful of executives at the top. National statistics on income, health, or education routinely get quoted as if they describe a typical person, when in reality, they're often dragged around by a small number of extreme cases at either end. We are, today, just as capable of mistaking an average for a typical life as any documentary that told you cavemen died at 30. Health statistics work the same way. A country's average life expectancy today can rise or fall significantly based on infant mortality rates and a handful of extreme outcomes, even while the lived experience of most adults barely changes year to year. The habit of reading one number and assuming it describes everyone hasn't gone anywhere. It just changed subjects, and it changed datasets. Every time a single average gets treated as the whole story, whether it's about ancient hunter-gatherers or a modern national census, the same blind spot is quietly at work. So the next time you hear that ancient humans didn't live past 30, you'll know what that number is actually measuring, and just as importantly, what it's quietly leaving out. You blow out 30 candles, and for the first time, you understand exactly why that used to be considered young, and exactly how much of that reputation you owe to a single misread average.